Bom dia. Eu tenho a honra de estar nesta mesa da conferência inaugural acompanhada pelo professor Jean-Claude Guédon e permito-me uma nota pessoal, que é agradecer a todos a vossa presença, a terem aceito o convite do Université para se juntarem a nós nesta 9ª edição da Conferência Luso-Brasileira sobre Acesso Aberto, que, como foi dito já, tivemos o maior gosto, o maior prazer em, durante um ano, preparar para vos acolher. Relativamente ao professor Jean-Claude Guédon, eu irei depois fazer uma breve apresentação, mas vou-lhe só dirigir algumas palavras. Eu sei que ele sabe algumas palavras de português. De qualquer maneira, good morning, Jean-Claude. We had already the opportunity to exchange some words when we were in the reception, yes. This is a privilege and an honor to having you with us. For me, it's a double privilege because I was present at the COAR annual meeting and you were also there. So I know that you have your talks about open access, about open science, and some of those ideas are really very stimulating, and that's why I'm also very happy that you can join us, because your insights will be very, very useful for our talks and to our debates and for this conference. So thank you very much. It is an honor and a pleasure having you at Université and having you at this 9th edition of the Luso-Brazilian Open Access Conference. So, agora, alguns elementos sobre, e como estão aqui não para me ouvir, é mesmo uma breve biografia sobre o professor Jean-Claude Guédon, que é professor na Universidade de Montréal, no Departamento de Literaturas e Línguas do Mundo, desde 1973. O seu percurso académico começou com os estudos de Química. É sempre interessante percebermos que acabamos num acesso aberto com proveniências de áreas completamente distintas. E estudou na Clarkson University em Nova York e obteve o seu doutoramento em História da Ciência pela Universidade de Wisconsin-Madison. As suas principais áreas de interesse estão relacionadas com a digitalização da cultura e neste âmbito tem refletido e tem escrito sobre as relações entre o texto e a tecnologia, a cibercultura, a publicação eletrónica, as bibliotecas digitais. Também se interessa pelas consequências legais, económicas e sociais da internet e tem estado envolvido e tem trabalhado também tem escrito sobre as questões relativas ao acesso livre à investigação, aos arquivos abertos e ao software open source. É membro de várias organizações no domínio da gestão e da disseminação da informação e do conhecimento e dois exemplos que encontrei foram o facto de ter presidido ao Advisory Board da Canadian Research Knowledge Network entre 1998 e 2003 e ter sido vice-presidente da Canadian Society for Humanities and Social Sciences entre 2006 e 2008. Tem também trabalhado como consultor de vários organismos governamentais, nomeadamente em França e no Canadá, em assuntos relativos à integração das novas tecnologias no currículo e também sobre a publicação eletrónica no domínio das humanidades e das ciências sociais. Como já referi, é autor de vários livros e artigos científicos, fundou a primeira revista académica canadiana online, a Surface, em 1991 e recebeu o prémio, entre outros, recebeu o prémio internacional Charles Helou para a francofonia pelo seu ensaio Penser la différence différemment, la francophonie et les réseaux, em 1996, e também o Prémio de Excelência da Associação Canadiana para as Humanidades Digitais, em 2005. E recentemente foi criado, em 2018, o Prémio Jean-Claude Guédon pelo Centre de Recherche Interuniversitaire sur les Humanités Numériques da Universidade de Montréal, para distinguir o melhor artigo em assuntos relacionados exatamente com a publicação académica, o acesso aberto, e claro que quem recebe o prémio, e vem aqui mesmo a propósito, tem que ter esse artigo em acesso aberto. Jean-Claude, merci d'être ici et the floor is yours. De nada.
Bom dia. That will be the end of my Portuguese. Many thanks for this invitation. Too many words. I don't deserve half of them. I'm particularly pleased to be here for, I think, very obvious reasons. Both Portugal and Brazil have played and are playing a really forward, really vanguard game in the whole open access, open science debate. I think Brazil with Cielo developed a system which, although I have some criticisms here and there, is globally so powerful and so inspiring that this is the enormous contribution that country has offered to the whole world, actually, as a model that could be tweaked, improved, but certainly followed. And I think in the area of not journals, but in the area of repositories and the so-called Green Road, which you have instituted all over your country with your autopistas. You have, and Minho, of course, and my good friend Eloy, you have taken the lead in how to try and develop, grow, and make sense out repositories, networks of repositories, and associated problems. So speaking to an audience like this is really a privilege, and I want to really underscore that. Many thanks. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm going to say something about open access mainly today, not because I do not want to talk about open science, but just to locate the problem a bit more, I would say, in a more focused manner. I would like to say that OA is about research and researchers. Open science is, once you have created this network of research, then you see how it works and fits within the whole social body and how you make science part of humanity and not just an elite outside group someplace there. But for the purpose of today, allow me to just focus on the researchers and their institutions, the funding agencies, and the publishers and the libraries that are all involved in the shaping of something which to me is very fundamental for understanding science. It's the whole issue of science as a great conversation. You might say that when the scientific revolution began, what happened was really a very subtle yet profound shift in the common collective mentality of a whole part of the world, namely Europe in this case, where people said knowledge is not brought to us outside by some divine revelation, but we're going to do what we can together to check each other's findings, and we're going to try and bootstrap us up and up and up in a kind of very modest and yet very human way. And that was the beginning of a new way of conceiving knowledge with which we are living today. Part of my talk is going to say we have to work very hard now with open access to maintain that ideal, in fact, perhaps to correct what's going on right now, because in some ways that old marvelous objective of creating the great conversation of knowledge for humanity is being, I would say, diverted in very strange ways by the present system. Our scientific communication system, our scientific publishing system, our scholarly publishing and communication systems are essentially flawed nowadays, and I'm going to try explaining how OA fits in this and what it can do about it. So, my great accusation is that publishers have affected the great conversation, which is not surprising. If you publish and you help communicate, you're going to affect what you're doing it. And we have to look at how they have done that. And as I've just said, open access will have to focus on the great conversation again if it wants to achieve, I think, its most fundamental aims. And in passing, if I say this, it's because in the last close to 20 years now, open access has been emerging, supported, developed by conversations that were really between other kinds of actors. Librarians and publishers were in a contentious relationship because of the way the price structure of journals had evolved. The costs were becoming unbearable, and as a result, a discussion evolved around this conflict. But in some funny ways, the whole center of all this, the researchers, were outside of that. I will try to explain that as well a little bit, but essentially the reason why they were outside of that is because they didn't have any other choice. The professional pressures on them, which I will go into a little bit, explain why researchers paradoxically have been excluded, have been staying outside the mainstay of the discussion between publishers and other partners and or actors around open access. The second point one has to remember about this is that open access, and it's often forgotten, essentially depends on digitization to exist. Or there were attempts to do open access-like things in the print world, in the purely print world. But at that time, these things were difficult, required a lot of organization, were costly. And the reason is very simple. If you go into the digital mode, the marginal cost of producing a copy of what you've prepared as a document falls to almost zero. And the marginal cost of disseminating that copy someplace also falls essentially down to zero, with the result that all you have to take care of is what publishers used to call the cost of first copy. That is, how do you prepare the text that's going to be disseminated? And that really reduces greatly the general cost of publishing. So as a result, you have to think of open access as really being viable only in an environment which is digital. But at the same time, this means that this enormous movement out of print into the digital world is going to bring about enormous changes in what we're talking about in terms of who are the objects and the actors of this world. Is a digital author the same as a print author? And the question may become quite important if you remember that the whole notion of a print author is what defines our notion of author. Before print, the notion of author was far less important and far more secondary than it is now. And so you have to talk about things like this. Is a document in the digital world the same as in a print world? Of course not. And again, if you go to the print world at its beginning, you see how the print world gradually freed himself from what a manuscript document was like. Are the processes accompanying the production of digital words and digital documents the same as in the print world? And again, that's not the case. You have to understand that the processes are different. And if you think, for example, of publishing in the scholarly world as really integrating four basic functions: certification, and then dissemination, and then preservation, and then, of course, I forget the fourth one, and that always happens during the... Yeah, the registration, which is, of course, the first one. That's why I forgot about it. So now you have them: registration, certification, preservation, dissemination, and preservation. In the print world, all these four functions appear visibly only at the end of the whole process, and all functions are bunched into one. So the one process. In the digital world, immediately you can ask, why not split the things? Why not perhaps do them in a different order? And why not allocate the responsibilities for each to different and perhaps several kinds of actors? These are some of the questions we're going to face, but which of course are very threatening to certain groups of people, namely publishers, who are used to having this beautifully well-organized one, you might say, crystalline structure, which is theirs, and which may have to rethink what their role in the future may well be. Now, again, if we go back in the past, we know of examples that show exactly similar processes. The scriptorium that produced the manuscript documents essentially disappeared, just to reappear in a very minor fashion, in a very temporary fashion, as the practice of copying teaching inside schools and universities for a couple of centuries. But otherwise, scriptoria disappeared. So publishers really may well be in the position where scriptoria were around 1500, which is an interesting issue to raise, I think, as well. So another problem OA has regularly faced is that it has talked about researchers a bit too glibly, a bit too fast. Researchers are researchers are researchers are researchers. We know what a researcher is. It has 2 ears, 2 legs, and a tail. We all know that, you know. So, oh, sorry about the tail. I guess they don't have a tail. But actually, researchers are many, or present many facets. They are information seekers, and to that, open access has responded very, very well. They are status seekers. They want to be recognized. They want to be perhaps associated with a great discovery or not so great discovery. And some of them interface with the whole publishing dissemination world by being presently in groups that are associated with journals, for example, or books, in presses. There are editors or on editorial boards. So researchers are a bit more complex than we used to think, perhaps a bit too fast, and open access may not have taken enough attention, paid enough attention to this particular dimension. In fact, OA, as I've said, has focused on the researcher as information seeker, and I must say it hasn't done a very good job on the researcher as a status seeker. In the case, let's use the traditional distinction about the green roads and the gold roads. On the gold road side, open access has essentially left the journals do their job, so to speak, without pushing further the analysis of what the job really was doing. And on the green road, you take the repositories and you put things in the repositories, but repositories have had a very difficult time defining a form of value for what they were taking stock of beyond what essentially the ultimate publication would offer in a journal. So status seeking through open access right now is not really very, very obvious. And that, I think, basically, fundamentally explains why researchers are not engaged. Researchers are knowledge seekers. Of course, we're all excited about our research. We all want to do the great discovery of the last millennium and so on. But the truth is, the reality is that we do our jobs as scientists and scholars. We do our little jobs. We are modest people. And as modest and good, solid researchers, but not Einsteins or Newtons, how many Einsteins and Newtons do you have? Probably about 2, one Einstein and one Newton. So, you know, and you have how many scientists in any given country? Hundreds of thousands, thousands at least, and even millions in some countries. So the result is that we haven't done a good job about really satisfying what these people are really doing their work for. They are doing their work because they have to work. Now, they like their work, that's true, but they are doing their work because they have to do their work. And remember that, because this is going to be important for evaluation. Are we evaluating these scientists and these scholars because they're great scientists or great scholars, or are we evaluating them because they are great workers? Are we doing it for intellectual reasons, or are we doing it for administrative reasons? Think about that. I'll come back to this term. So I've been saying that publishers have affected the great conversation, and I would clarify the issue by saying that they've taken control of the status issue, but this is an interesting story in itself, and I would like to go forward with it. Let's see a bit how they've done that. The first thing to drop is the illusion that journals have been journals ever since journals were invented. That in itself, of course, is a stupid statement because one should immediately ask, why were journals invented in the first place? You know, what was behind de Sallo's mind in Paris in 1665 in January, and in Oldenburg's mind in about April or May of the same year, when they both created a so-called scientific journal? Well, many things. In fact, the differences between the two journals, the Journal des Savants in Paris and the Philosophical Transactions in London, are sufficiently different from each other to see that these people were responding to pressures coming from behind that were really bringing about the need to create something like a journal. But these kinds of journals were at first attempting to do things which have gone well past or have been left way behind us now. For example, in Europe, in the recent book which I recommend to you by Alex Cheeser, which is called The Scientific Journal, it was published about 3 months ago, demonstrates that the first efforts of the journals were to try and create publications which in look, feel, and everything else look like a strong presentation from academies. In particular, the philosophical transactions suffered from the fact that the Royal Society did not take on the philosophical transactions as an institutional journal for several decades. You have to wait until the 1750s for that almost. So you have journals being created for reasons which are very different from what we think journals do. When journals continue in the 19th century, they become something very interesting for us, which I will return to also, and that is the issue that journals are the voice of a community. A group of researchers interested by a set of problems decide to find, you might say, a broadcasting station. Might be the same as if someone with a political agenda nowadays created a television station to diffuse a certain program. These scientists are trying to diffuse and to disseminate a research program which was done through a journal. And they subsidized it themselves. They paid their dues to the society, and the society used their dues to essentially produce that journal. And when the journal was produced in 300, 400, 500 copies, they often bartered that with similar societies elsewhere in Europe, with the result that with one journal and the dues of a few members, you could end up having a very nice library of information about science with maybe 200, 300, 400 journals coming in regularly. This is a remarkable achievement. We've forgotten about that. So the journals continue to evolve, and they really evolved in the 50s, after the Second World War. Because one thing you have to remember in all of these stories I've told you is that most efforts to make commercial journals until about 1955, that is roughly 60 years ago, essentially were very moderately successful or failed. The journals went out of business pretty fast. Their returns on investment, if you speak in economic terms, were low. And of course, the prices were kept also low because they could not sell these journals very high. Is it surprising? You're doing a piece of study on a very esoteric part of mathematics. How many people can read that? How many people are going to buy your journal? Not very exciting for most people. So you're going to have essentially a piece of publication which commercially did not work until 1955. then things changed. Then things changed for a very simple reason. At that point, because of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, the budgets of research across the world just went up enormously, which meant the number of publications, scientists, of course, researchers, but publications also went up enormously, and the societies-based journals, by and large, not all of them, but many of them, just couldn't do it. They couldn't publish anymore. They didn't have the means to publish that much, that quickly, for the needs of their you might say, customers, to use that kind of term. And the result of that is that some publishers, Robert Maxwell being the most famous among them, found a way to introduce themselves into this system. And the way they introduced themselves in this system was in according to two different directions. One of them was to say, all your journals are from national societies. We're going to do international journals, and we're going to do them in English, because English is becoming the international language of science. So that was one first area, which immediately, of course, improved the marketability of the journals. They were open to a larger segment of the world population. The other thing was that they started looking at journals as a way to evaluate people. Now think of it. You publish in a journal. If the journal has a good reputation, which was the case before the Second World War, of course that reputation reflected well on you, but that was the end of it. Oh, it's published in the Society of such and such an important country with such and such an important society. This is fine, it's nice. It's really nice to have done that. But this was just a question of reputation, which was secondary. The first important part was essentially yourself. Who are you and what do you publish? In 1936, Einstein was in the United States by then, and he sent a paper to be published by the American Institute of Physics. And unknown to Einstein, that American Institute of Physics did something that looked absolutely stupid to him, which was to send his paper to peer reviewers. And Einstein immediately said, well, what the hell are you doing there? I am Einstein. You know, who are these people who are judging my paper? In fact, I can show you they're wrong. You know, so if you don't want to publish my paper, I'll publish it someplace else. My name is good enough. And he did. He published it someplace else. So the reputation was based on the name. And for most of us who are not Einsteins, we would say, well, I've been being published in several times in reputable and so on journals, allows me to enhance my own visibility, but it was done in a sort of fuzzy, easy way, which everybody relied on. There was no real problem with that. Things changed when suddenly evaluation was applied to individuals through journals, and that was reinforced by something else which came at that point, which was the rise of the Science Citation Index and the journal citation records, and then people started doing rankings of journals by citations. And then what you got from that was a way to evaluate people that are publishing in such and such a journal because they are in a journal ranked in such and such a way in their particular field. And all this was quantified. And you know, quantification is marvelous. It looks so objective. Don't you agree with me? I mean, if we had the temperature every day by saying, today it's very hot, today it's hot, today it's so-so, and so on, to be enough, actually, to live quite well, but we need to know that it's 37.3 degrees to know that it's really hot. What's the difference with 38.4? I don't know, but it's still very hot. But we live with this kind of thing about numbers. And then, of course, when you add 3 decimals to the whole thing, as does the impact factor that you all know, you end up with having a sort of connotation of precision. And then when you have a connotation of precision, you create a secondary connotation of accuracy, which is not the same. You can have very precise balances that are quite inaccurate, you know. And then you have a whole system in which essentially ends up, the conclusion inescapably is that the system is working not logically, not scientifically at all, despite appearances, but rhetorically, absolutely rhetorically. So we have now people being judged by going through a system of metrics, creating rankings along the journals, and from that point on, evaluation is on for the administrators. These people are published in Lancet, Nature, and so on, in the Cell, Science, and so on, and New England Journal of Medicine, and what else? And therefore, they must be so good. The only problem with this argument, beside all the other arguments I just adduced, is that the impact factor is based on an average. But inside a journal, and single journal, however high, its impact factor is decided by just a very small minority of articles, which are sky high. The distribution is never regular. It's a very, very lopsided distribution. When you take the average of a very lopsided distribution, you're creating nonsense. You're creating madness. And then you use that to administer funding agencies' way to grant allocations of money for researchers, tenure and promotion inside the universities, etc., etc. You see how the system is happening. Now, there is another problem where this issue now is going to affect the great conversation. When you send a paper to a journal, what you are really doing is asking the journal to evaluate how citable your paper is going to be from their point of view. How many citations is this paper likely to gather around it? Which means that if you want to be accepted by a journal, you'd better check what kind of problems they're interested in, and then you try to fit within these problems. Now, all this sounds okay on the surface, but now put yourself in the shoes of an administrator within a granting agency, a funding agency of research. They have a research program. They vet their people through juries to allocate the money, and they do it extremely rigorously. I've done enough of that to know how rigorous it is. They reject enormous proportions of these people. And then the people do their work, and when they publish to the journal, then they say, how can I orient my paper to make it look for them as a highly citable thing, so that by the time the paper appears in the journal, it may have nothing to do with a research program that allowed the financing of the work. Now, from a person inside a research agency anywhere in the world, I think that should be certainly a form of concern. I don't think it has been sufficiently studied, but it is the kind of thing that explains why in many countries, scientists end up studying things that are of no importance in the local country or in the local region, and are not rewarded when they try to do so, because then only so-called local journals will take their research. And of course, you know, this is, if they're not in the web of science, these journals do not count, and so on. So you see how the whole conversation of science is being covertly, insidiously, totally subverted by a system of evaluation which is actually completely organized to do one thing and one thing only. When you talk about evaluation, you talk about putting value upon something. What the publishers had to do was to find a way to merge together and work together some form of intellectual evaluation, which is present. It's not entirely absent, I'm not arguing that, but also to make it work with a form of economic evaluation. We're going to support that journal only to the extent that this journal is making the right kinds of evaluations to get the right kinds of citations to be subscribed to or bought or put inside packages that libraries will buy. And if it doesn't do so, we may well drop the journal or simply kill it, as has happened recently in Elsevier, because the journal was not responding to the economic needs of Elsevier. Now, let me ask you just a general question. What is more important in the great conservation? The economic well-being of Elsevier or the conversation itself among specialists of a particular field? That is how publishers, by the great modification of what journals became after 1955, have done to our scientific communication system since that period. For the last 60 years, we have lived in this flawed system of communication in science and scholarship. So to summarize all this, I think that by adding evaluation to the functions of publishing, which is not an eternally existing thing. I've heard people mention to me, oh, publishing involves 5 functions, and the evaluations comes along. No, that was not the case. And by giving, that's more covert and less well recognized, giving a new meaning to evaluation, the long digression I just gave you, you end up with having a tool which has administrative value rather than intellectual value. And I think that is really fundamentally wrong and at the same time fundamentally important. So if open access in particular, open science also, of course, has to deal with publishers, it's only because in the ways in which the great conversation has been deeply altered. And the main problem, as you see by now, is tied with the notion of journals. Now, this is going to be a hell of a problem because we are so wedded to the notion of journals. We're so, scientists, scholars think in terms of journals nowadays. When you present your promotion file or when you present a research file, the journals in which you publish are the shortcut for juries to say this is a serious researcher or this is not a serious researcher. I think people in Brazil particularly are very deeply aware of that by the conflict or inherent tension between so-called international journals. The thing that Maxwell internationalized the journals in 1955 has been totally forgotten by now, and the fact that it was developed as a marketing ploy has also been forgotten. It has become a standard of excellence instead of quality. We can go through that as well if you want me to unravel that bad term. And on the other hand, you have the local journals, which may be extremely good, or in which very good articles may appear. Remember that in any given article, the distribution of quality of articles always varies enormously. My best papers have not appeared in the so-called best journals. I can guarantee that. In fact, one of my very best papers appeared in Italian in a journal that's now defunct. So it's the way things happen in scholarship. But in this case, the whole effort of development, of growth, of having a form of research that's relevant for something other than the interests of the journals has become extremely difficult because of this real important weight of the impact factor in the journal rankings on a number of institutions that use this as a shortcut, as a shorthand for quality, which is, of course, I would say, to speak a bit harshly, is a lazy form of thinking. So, how do we move forward? Well, I would say we should, in a sense, go back to the society's journals of past, which were the voice of communities. And in fact, we should probably have these journals behave like the journals of societies in the past, which didn't think that they owned their articles, they published them. It was common in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, for a society getting aware of an important paper in Russian, in chemistry, for example, with Mendeleev, to have these papers republished, translated in German. It was normal. It was normal to do that. The journal didn't feel it had to own the articles in the sense that it didn't feel that if someone republished the article, it was going to hurt their sales. What they were absolutely happy about is that their article and their journal were being cited in another journal abroad. And that created a kind of worldwide community where journals exchanged information. And an article could appear if it was sufficiently important, and a journal could appear again in another journal, and it would be a mark of quality. The more an article was reprinted, the better the article appeared, which makes sense somewhere. People want to go through the trouble of translating and republishing something with the cost of republishing. There must be something to that paper. It must be good. And mixing up intellectual property with the circulation of ideas in journals is nonsense. So we have to reinvent journals so that they can become the sub-conversation of the great conversation without limiting the possibilities about republishing parts of any journal into a different kind of journal. Some articles are very multi or interdisciplinary and can circulate through several communities. The value of these articles could be judged by the very circulation across different communities rather than being owned under copyright law by one journal, so much so that sometimes the author is not even allowed to copy his own article from that journal. Now, if you don't call that utter nonsense, I don't know what utter nonsense is. So the journals as redefined right now, community voice, being able to pick up text from one journal to another and so on, must, well, I could say, populate what is really, to me, the really crucial part, which are platforms. Now, platforms is a term that emerges with the digital world. In the print world, it used to be called, in some ways, shelves and the card cabinets, card classifying device, which allowed you to move through the shelves. We call that portals nowadays in the digital world. Platforms are portals plus. They do more than portals, and I'm going to talk about that quickly. Platforms should be designed, in fact, are designed to organize three levels, which I sometimes call the triple sociology of our documentary world. A document-to-document relationship. You can have citations leading to another text, or whatever link you want to do. If you know the web at all, you know what I'm talking about. Researcher-to-document relationships. You can have, at that point, ways of working with the document, which are entirely new. Text and data mining, for example, being the broad category that would add to the act of reading as we normally organize it. And of course, all this feeds back upon researchers themselves, and it changes the researcher-to-researcher relationships. The journals I am calling for are really elements that should be developed on platforms which have the aim of doing precisely what I described here. So if I say that, I'm just saying something extremely simple. Platforms are therefore an essential part of research infrastructures. And many funding agencies, I know, are deeply involved in research infrastructures. So put platforms at the center of your efforts there. It's absolutely crucial. And therefore, it's your responsibility in the research funding agencies. It's simply your responsibility. And if you don't believe me, well, sorry, but some people have already understood. You know, the Wellcome Trust research, which is developing right now, and the Gates Foundation are doing that. And why are they private foundations and not public foundations doing that? Probably because as private organizations, they have a bit more leeway to experiment, a bit more, you might say, less fear of being judged badly if they fail. After all, they're giving money to society. You can't accuse people of doing bad things if they give money the bad way once or twice, once in a while. But what are they doing, these people? And that's where it becomes really interesting. What is happening at that point is that in the Wellcome Trust research is also to redefine the whole notion of what is publishing. I told you earlier in this lecture or this presentation that this is an old prof reaction to say lecture, but I must apologize for that. I told you that the open access is deeply, deeply digital, and that publishing in the digital world was changed. The functions of publishing, the 4 functions, and I won't ask Eloy to repeat them for me, I'll have them all this time. I think it's registration, certification, dissemination, and preservation. This was a false one. My senior moments are becoming ever more frequent. These are being disaggregated and reorganized differently. And so at the Wellcome Trust, what is happening is that people that have been granted money by the Wellcome Trust, and therefore selected like very few people have ever been selected, can immediately put their papers on this platform without any peer review up front. But they can call for peer reviews themselves, and of course, the organizers of the platform can call for peer reviewers. But all this is open. So when you peer review an article on peer review on the Wellcome Trust research, you put your name behind your peer review publicly. That has a very good consequence. You begin to behave civilly. You don't insult people. You don't tell them they're a bunch of whatever. You don't try and resolve your professional conflicts with these people, at least not too overtly. And it's all open, all in the open. And after a while, with the discussion, feedback, and all that, and you really get the sense of a conversation at that point, maybe you're going to come to the conclusion with your co-authors that the article really would be improved if you could do a second version of this article. And now this second version of the article begins to resemble an object which I tried to theorize a while back by calling it a crystal of knowledge. Instead of talking about articles, books, and all that, let's speak about crystals of knowledge. And why crystals? Well, simply because crystals are hard, crystals have shapes, but they can grow, they can break, they can bifurcate in some ways. So in many ways, what they represent is that in the constant flow of the conversation of science, in the great conversation, you need small moments of stability so as to restart the whole discussion on a well-established platform, I was about to say, the platform within the platform. And you can go with this, you can go forward in this fashion step by step, but then you're going to say, well, how do I use this kind of publication? Well, yes, something has changed. Publishers always insist on owning the version of record. You've heard that phrase, I'm sure, the version of record. Well, maybe in this case, what you're going to need very closely is a record of versions, a record of the various versions. And in fact, what you're getting at that point is something very similar to the world of free software, where you have a strict following of the versions that are appearing one after the other, and you can go back and see what was done here and there, and how to, perhaps some things were poorly or wrongly abandoned, others were rightly added, and so on. You have a whole history of the debate about the point that you're interested in. Because don't make any mistake about it, despite the illusions created by print, which gives too much fixity and solidity to passing ideas, the knowledge that we create keeps on evolving. We just need enough stability once in a while to be able to discuss well together and move forward well together. This is precisely what the funders, such as Wellcome and Gates, are doing. I think every funding agency should become involved in similar experiments and try to see what happens with this kind of device. And even better, I'm talking about funding agencies. Let's have consortia of agencies. And that can help another element appear. If you put together several agencies together, the issue of objectivity, the issue of, you might say, of honesty of thought is going to be reinforced. You're going to be in a situation in which the funding agencies are going to observe each other and say, I don't think that your judgment on this particular piece of work is as good as it should have been. We have researchers that think differently, and then new conversations can emerge. And the great conversation is reinforced, and it's broadened. It's broadened in two ways. It's broadened by the people involved, and it's broadened in the kinds of problems being raised. Cielo, in a sense, started doing that for a very different reason, for questions of financial stability, when it asked funding agencies of Latin America to guarantee the presence of the journals they were putting forth. But in a sense, Cielo, by doing that, has already created that consortium of funding agencies, and probably could go one step further in the development of this kind of platform. It might be interesting to see each one of these funding agencies creating their platforms and then forming a joint platform together with the right kinds of operations on top of that. And in doing so, in passing, you could learn quite a bit from what's happening with Open Air, which was mentioned at some point earlier in the presentation of the conference, and of course, its Latin American equivalent, La Referencia, which needs to be, I think, foregrounded and organized as well as possible. It might be a way to tweak the S-plan, which right now is really a kind of, let's go forward and let's have a lot of open access as quickly as we can by hook or by crook, not just about, except we don't want hybrid journals, but we want everything else, and we'll pay what's needed. The intention is all right. The urgency and the impatience are well taken, but maybe a little bit more thinking about what you really try to push forward in this kind of plan would be helpful. But the S-plan has managed to bring together about 12 or 13 organizations. Now it's more than the original 11. Which is a good base as well. So here again, you have perhaps the possibility of thinking the Wellcome Trust system, the Gates Foundation system, the Cielo approach to joining research institutions, funding institutions together, and the S-plan, and maybe all together they can start doing something really, really interesting. So in conclusion, open access, if you try to ask what it is, I would say nowadays is that it's about realigning the tasks of scholarly digital publishing with the aims, the original aims of the great conversation. Or to put it more spectacularly, if you know H.G. Wells in his book of 1936, it's all about creating the world brain. And I will leave you with these stupid words.